Right? Yeah. So we can start the next session. And the first speaker is Kibrik, Institute of Linguistics of Russian Academy of Sciences, and what will take research, whether it's frequency or rationality. And the talk is the interaction of the verbal, prosodic, and visual components in language understanding. So you're welcome, and could you please switch off the device?
Yeah, I'm very glad to be here. Thanks to the organizers for inviting not a hardcore experimentalist to this conference. I think that's because this the faculty of liberal arts and sciences. As all of us know, the mainstream linguistic approach to language says that language consists of hierarchically organized segmental units of different levels of this hierarchy, and thus linguistic form is considered consisting of verbal elements alone. But at the same time, as again we know pretty well, apart from sound, there are other channels of communication or components of communication, in the first place through vision. And this is what is called body language, and this includes gesture, mimic, gaze, posture, and other elements. And also there is another vocal channel, prosody, that is non-verbal, that is non-segmental, but still it's a part of sound. And the prosody consists of many elements such as intonation, tempo, loudness, and so on and so forth. And of course, prosody is important. For example, if you hear in your apartment people quarreling in the next door apartment, you may not hear any verbal elements, but you can still know from the prosody what's going on to some extent, okay? So I'm going to proceed on the assumption that there are three components or communication channels: the verbal component, prosody, and body language. And they can be treated as separate channels to a certain extent. And they all cooperate in getting message from the speaker to the addressee in each individual act of communication. This is what is sometimes called multimodal approach, and this has been known for a long time. For example, back in 1963, Reformatsky was asking the question how the nonverbal text, so to speak, interacts with the verbal text. And there is a number of other more recent quotations on this screen. For example, Kress said that a multimodal approach assumes that the message is spread across all the modes of communication, and if this is so, then each mode is a partial bearer of the overall meaning of the message. There is also this somewhat aphoristic saying by Skolan, who said that any use of language is inescapably multimodal. In another author, Aum, said that communication is, of course, inherently multimodal, with the speech content being modified by prosody and delivered in parallel with facial expression and so forth. Also, in biology, experimental psychology, and cognitive neuroscience, there is rapidly growing literature that clarified that multisensory perception and integration cannot be predicted by studying the senses in isolation. So this is a more general phenomenon than just language. So the question arises, what is the contribution of different channels to the overall communicative performance of the speaker and the understanding by the hearer? Of course, again, as I said before, the traditional approach of linguistics is that the verbal channel is so central that other channels, even if they are worth any mention, they are downgraded as paralinguistics. However, in some other disciplines, such as applied psychology, it is often said that body language conveys more than a half of the overall information in communication, and the prosody about 1/3, and the verbal component conveys only 7% of all the information being transmitted. These numbers go back to the study by Mehrabian in 1971, and they are being replicated in dozens and dozens of psychological publications. In other words, in connection with this, I can also cite the work by Kreidlin, who quotes a wisdom that words may be what men use when all else fails. So these are two radically different, opposite approaches, and I would like to address the question, who is right, the mainstream linguistic approach or the view that other channels of communication are more important. So I'm going to rely on this classification of communication channels. Of course, visual channel consists of sub-channels, and prosody also is not homogeneous, but just for the sake of simplicity, let's think about 3 distinct channels. In order to address this question, the following experimental design was suggested by myself a few years ago. The idea is to isolate the 3 communication channels, select some sample discourse, and alter it in 8 different versions, keeping all of the 3 channels, 2 of them, only 1 of them, altogether 8 theoretical possibilities, present these 8 type of stimulus to distinct groups of participants, and then check the degree of understanding in each situation. Such assessment of the degree of understanding may lead to an estimate of the contributions of individual communication channels. There have been a number of studies by myself together with my students, which are listed on this screen, and I will be particularly relying on the paper Kibrik and Elbert 2008, and more recent diploma thesis by Natalia Molchanova in 2010. So in the studies that we did with Ekaterina Elbert, we were using as a discourse stimulus the Russian TV serial Tayny Следствия, Mysteries of Investigation. There was an experimental excerpt that was preceded by a context excerpt, and the specific technique to separate 2 vocal channels, the verbal channel and the prosody, was to use running subtitles for the verbal component. And for prosody, we used the filter that was superimposed on the sound signal to create this behind-the-wall effect. There were about 100 participants in this experiment, and as I said before, 8 experimental groups. Group 0 watched only the context excerpt, so they didn't see anything, but they were still asked questions about the part they didn't see, to figure out how much can be guessed, so to speak. There were 3 groups with 1 communication channel, 3 groups with 2 communication channels, and 1 group that was shown the original material where all the 3 channels are working together. This is the original material. I will play a little bit of it. Can you hear well enough? Okay, that's enough. Now the verbal plus visual condition is the situation when you see the video plus the running subtitles. Something like this. And the visual plus prosodic condition is the situation when you see the video and also hear the prosody but not the verbal component. Well, I think you get the idea, okay? So the context and the experimental excerpts were shown to a group of participants on a large screen in a large room, and each subject was instructed to watch the context and the experimental part, and then answer a set of questions which were multiple choice questions. There were 23 questions in the questionnaire. Each subject was asked to choose only one answer out of 4 listed variants, like in this list. There is one correct answer, which shows that the participant has understood what was going on in the film. It's number C here in this case. There are 2 distractors, A and B, and there was also a non-realistic version of the answer, just to filter out those people who didn't get the idea altogether. So the percentage of correct answers was used as an assessment of a subject's degree of understanding, and we got these quantitative results. In these 3 columns, you see the degree of understanding in terms of percentage of correct answers by the participants who had access only to one of the communicative channels. So you can see from these numbers that each of the 3 communicative channels are substantially informative, because they are significantly they give rise to significantly higher percentages than the condition 0. Okay, this is the first conclusion. There's also a kind of hierarchy of informative power. The verbal component is most informative, the visual is less so, and the prosodic still a bit less informative. Another interesting fact that can be derived from this picture is this dip, quantitative dip here, which is the situation of the visual plus prosodic combination. Apparently, people are not used to this combination, and somehow information from the visual component from prosody do not integrate well enough. There was a continuation of this line of research in the studies by Natalia Molchanova more recently, and I am going to rely here on her diploma thesis, Contribution of Information Channels in Understanding Spoken Discourse, Methodological Aspects. The reason for doing this study was that in the prior studies done by Elbert, there were several shortcomings that can be classified into 5 categories. Those difficulties related with the stimulus material, the difficulties with the singling out the prosodic channel, with the verbal channel, the questionnaire per se, and the interviewing procedure. So some improvements were done in connection with each of these 5 kinds of problems, and probably I'm going to skip some of my material, but just briefly, instead of the movies, we used the natural dialogue that was prepared specifically for this study, because in some cases with the movie material we saw that people were guessing correct answers too often from the logic of the plot, and also some participants were familiar with the film, so the group was not homogeneous in this respect. So in novel material of the natural dialogue kind was created, and I'll show you a little piece of it. So these are 2 characters participating in this video. It's a figure guessing game. The young lady is making certain figures on the table with the toothpicks, and the guy is supposed to figure out what's what are these figures?
Найдем сразу несколько комбинаций и придется угадать, сколько гаражных. Ага, а вот для этого не нужно гараж и 40 коробки.
Okay. Instead of the same-sex speakers, we used different-sex speakers in this study because in the prosody alone condition it was difficult to get the difference between the speakers. In terms of the creation of the prosodic channel, the filter imposed on the original sound was somewhat improved, because in the previous study, as you probably heard, the signal was too noisy. I can show you now how this worked out. Okay. As for the verbal channel alone, there was a difficulty with the subtitles method because somehow the perception of the graphic material interacts with watching the video image. So the idea was developed to create some kind of spoken prosody free signal, and I'm going to show you what this sounds like. Or maybe I'm not going to show you.
Ну, сейчас пять клашей, ну давай, подойди уже.
Мне кажется, тут вообще.
Нет, тут есть что-то, принцип, есть.
Okay, so the way how this was created was to have the speaker to pronounce each individual word separately in a prosody-free way and then glue them in the right order so that you get the whole of the verbal component but without any intonation and loudness and tempo distinctions and so on and so forth. As for the questionnaire, there was also some improvement over the prior studies. In particular, we were able to achieve a better contrast or gap between group 0, that didn't see the experimental excerpt at all, and group 3, that saw the whole thing. And this was done through identifying trivial questions and also unfortunate questions, which led to the too low results in group 3. So the result of this improvement procedure was the percentages shown at the bottom of the screen. Only about 25% of the correct answers in group 0, which makes pretty good sense because there were 4 versions of the answer, so it's just a matter of chance if you didn't see anything. And the result for group 3 was pretty high. It wasn't quite 100%, but it was pretty close. As for the interviewing procedure, we used a much more balanced group of subjects, and also we got rid of the situation of the large room with multiple people sitting together and doing the experiment together so that they could possibly interact and affect each other. This was done this time in a remote implementation. Stimulus materials were uploaded to the well-known YouTube resource, and people were following the questionnaire through a document in Google Docs. So supposedly in this situation all participants were in more comparable conditions. So the results we got in the study in 2010 are shown on the right side of this screen, and you can compare it to what was done in the previous study. And in the first place, the general picture is remarkably similar. The whole design of the experiment was completely different, but the results are very similar. All three channels are substantially informative. You can compare individual channel results in the oval to the group 0 results shown with the arrow. There is still the same hierarchy, verbal over visual over prosodic channel, and the visual plus prosodic condition dip is even sharper. So apparently this effect is very persistent. In some other respects we have cleaner results because these were more methodologically elaborate. Having two channels apparently is much better than having one channel. You can compare these two triplets of the columns in the picture, and we also see that the verbal and the visual channels integrate really well. This result of having two channels together is very close to the rightmost column, which is the group that saw the original material. If you want to assess the contribution of three channels in terms of the overall success, we can make an assumption which is not quite right, but it is just an assumption that the three channels are independent, and then normalize their contributions to 100%. And in this case, we get the following results from the two studies, which are again remarkably similar. Like for the verbal component, 39% of the overall input in the 2008 study, compared to 38% in the 2010 study. And other figures are also very close. So again, we see that in spite of the very significant differences in the actual experimental design, we get similar results. So there must be something behind this coinciding figures. There is also a facet of Molchanova's work that I would like to briefly mention. She studied the differences between the male and female participants of the experiments, and she found that women had substantial advantage in the verbal-only situation. There is almost 11% more correct answers in women in this condition, whereas men had an advantage in this very unusual and difficult to process situation of visual plus prosodic information integration. So I leave it to all of you to interpret these results. Just wanted to mention them really briefly. So coming to the conclusions, it seems that all communication channels are highly significant. So the traditional linguistic view that language is just words is apparently wrong, but at the same time the verbal channel is the leading one. So the viewpoint popular in applied psychology that words only convey 7% of all information is apparently wrong. Now information from the prosodic and the visual channels is primarily used through integration with the verbal channel which plays the central and the leading role. And it is for this reason that people have difficulties with this condition when you have visual and prosodic information only. And finally, very similar results obtained in very different conditions apparently show that there are certain constant and robust tendencies in this kind of data, in this kind of experimental design. There is a number of important questions that are very interesting to me because I would like to continue this line of studies, and I'm interested in your input on these issues. One of them is, what is better, the auditory or graphic presentation of the verbal alone material, and maybe some additional technique of getting the verbal-only material can be developed. I don't know so far. And also, I'm interested in choosing an optimal or better discourse type. Maybe we can think of something better than what used in these two kinds of studies that I showed you. And also, I'm interested in other suggestions that you might have on this approach. Especially, I'm glad to ask this question in the in front of the group of experimentalists, because I said at the beginning, I am not primarily an experimental linguist. So that's it. Thanks for your attention.
Dasha, will you switch on the device? Thank you ever so much for such an intriguing presentation. But what amazed me is that women are so much more verbal.
Yeah, in fact...
But I would predict that they might get intuitive.
I think this fact may be interpreted in different ways. One possibility is to say that, as you said, that women are more verbal and they find more information in the verbal material than men do. Or I discussed it with Mira a couple of days ago, and she suggested that maybe women are able to compensate for the lack of context somehow, that men turn out to be unable to do, and they only need things said in words. But I guess we need to have another experiment to differentiate between these two different interpretations.
Mm-hmm. So many questions. So I think you are the first. Yes.
So in the explanation of the three channels, was the same. And please, what happened in the information was contradictory?
Well, we didn't test that, but there are studies like that. There are studies in which gesture contradicts verbal content. For example, an experiment participant is showing the event of giving, and the gesture that the speaker does is the gesture of taking. And then they ask the participant what happened afterwards, and there is about 2-to-1 result. Like 2 people out of 3 say that it was, they follow the gestural component and 1 follows the verbal component. That's what I read.
That's the relation of psychotherapy. So who is the next? I think you.
Back to the slide of the results, when you showed the results,
This one?
No, the graph.
Yes.
I like that.
Yes.
Thank you. So you interpret the visual plus phonic information as the, whereas what I can see is actually, I interpret this in terms of gain. So for example, you have prosodic, which is about 50%, right? Mm-hmm. You have visual, which is also about 50%. And then you have visual plus prosodic at about 50% again. So what I think is that basically it's the gain that verbal gives you on top of this 50%. So this 60-70 that you see is about 20 that is provided by the verbal information. Even in the first verbal prosodic and visual, you have about 20% increase in information. So when you look at the graph with both visual and prosodic, consider the 50 or 60 as the baseline of information you can get from any particular channel. So it just tells us that verbal information is about 20% on top of the average minimum, the average baseline. Then it is quite fine that verbal plus anything will provide you 10% increase over this new zero. You just need to scale it in a way.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion, but I think it's generally in line with what I was suggesting about the central role of verbal component.
It's difficult to interpret something as a diff necessarily because it shouldn't be. So, well, if you consider it the gain in information versus no gain in information,
It's a diff because it's much lower than these two situations. But I agree that your interpretation is quite appropriate.
As for but it still is an interesting factor for those boring. But I think it's also really habit, because when we talk on the phone, we do not have any visual information, and yet we understand each other perfectly. So I think the understand that psychologists actually should probably, in certain situations, we are used already to the fact that we do not have this information. Versus the cases where in, say, other modalities, you have to see in order to understand.
Yeah, exactly. This is a very unusual situation, yeah.
So I guess it could be a very screening guide to think.
Pardon?
Often called as a national condition where you do not have visual information and you have to get a lot of
Yeah.
Excuse me, sorry, we have to proceed. Yes, please.
I would just like to point out that in the situation where you have verbal plus prosody and visual plus prosody, the amount of prosody that we have for the two situations is different. So when you have verbal plus prosody, you keep the voice quality and you keep the rate of speech, which you lose when you use the verbal hand. So actually the game cannot really be comfortable.
Yeah, that's one of the methodological problems that really do bother me, but so far we haven't been able to come up with a cleaner methodology. If you can suggest something. Of course, we're trying to tease apart those things that are really so tightly interwoven, like tempo.
I'm sorry, what if we postpone this to general discussion? Unfortunately, because I also have some questions about cross-cultural differences in gestural culture that might influence.
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.